Good afternoon, and welcome to the Jewish Policy Center webinar, today featuring Lahav Harkov of the Jerusalem Post. I'm Shoshana Bryan, Senior Director of the JPC, and your host. Before we hear her, and believe me, you are going to learn a lot today from her, I'm going to give you the JPC commercial. We were founded in 1985 as a 501c3 nonprofit organization providing analysis of foreign and domestic policy by scholars, academics, and commentators. You can find us on our website, jewishpolicycenter.org. There you can sign up for our Insight articles and our magazine In Focus quarterly. The fall issue of In Focus will be out by the end of the month. It's called What Makes America, America. And let me tell you, we have some very interesting answers. jewishpolicycenter.org. Oh, and while you're on the website, you can find the catalog of webinars we have been doing since 2020, our hit parade, if you will. JPC supports a strong American defense capability, U.S.-Israel security cooperation, and missile defense. We support the legitimacy and integrity of Israel against anyone who would deny them. As an organization that sits slightly to the right of center, the JPC advocates for small taxes, small government, low taxes, free trade, fiscal responsibility, energy security, free speech, and intellectual diversity. It's a big plate. And we also support some outstanding speakers, including today's guest, Lahav Harkov, Senior Contributing Editor at the Jerusalem Post and the Post's diplomatic correspondent. She analyzes and reports on Israel's relations with the world, on the Prime Minister's office, the National Security Council, the Foreign Ministry, and more. She was the Post's top analyst and reporter in the Knesset for over 8 years and is the former news editor and managing editor of jpost.com. Lahav Harkov is an expert on Israel's domestic and international politics, having interviewed major figures across the political spectrum, and she is the inside scoop on the country's top lawmakers and diplomats. That would make a great webinar for the Israeli election, but that's not where we are today. Lahav is often invited to lecture on Israeli government and politics in Israel and abroad. She's been to AIPAC, the Conference of Presidents. She's done honest reporting and more. That's honest reporting both ways, the organization honest reporting and honest reporting. She has done the BBC, France 24, CTV, and Sky News, among others, and published articles in Commentary, the New York Post, Tablet, the National Interest, the Tower, Jewish Week, and the Hebrew language paper, Makor Rishon. You should follow her on Twitter. The Jewish Telegraphic Agency once named her among its most influential people in Jewish Twitter. Lahav grew up in New Jersey. We've already compared notes on where, and moved to Israel when she was 17. She has a degree in political science and communications from Bar-Ilan University and lives in Tel Aviv with her husband and 2 children. Lahav Harkov, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for having me, and hi everyone. It's a big group. We got a good crowd today. So thank you everyone. So I'm here to talk about where things are going with the Iran deal, especially in terms of Israel. And the most up-to-date sort of information that we have right now is that things are on hold. But I am going to talk about, first of all, what the latest draft says, and then sort of how we got to the point where it looks like things are going to be on hold for a little while. So I'm going to start with the draft. I'm going to ask everyone to forgive me because I'm going to be looking at notes a little bit, which I don't like to do on Zoom, but this is like a lot of really little details to pay attention to. And so I wanted to make sure I get it all right. So at the end of July, the EU came out with what it said is the final draft of the deal. The EU is the coordinator of the talks. And they delineate the implementation of the deal. You know, we all know, I think, the broad sort of strokes of the deal where sanctions are lifted, and then there's restrictions on Iran's nuclear program, but then there's also what's called the sunset clauses, and those restrictions on Iran's nuclear program gradually expire, whereas the sanctions remain lifted. So that's like, you know, anyone who is suspicious of Iran and believes it when it says it, you know, wants to hurt Israel and sees its record of supporting terrorism can already see the weaknesses of the deal just from its premise. but we'll get now into the details of how it would be implemented. So the EU draft starts with what they call day zero. That's the day that the deal is signed. What's called the Joint Commission, which is sort of a meeting of all the different countries involved in the deal, would meet, but the US would not be there because the US withdrew from the deal in 2018, and they would not be allowed to rejoin until sort of the end of these steps, or until what's called implementation day. But by then, Iran and the West are supposed to reach, or at least the Western countries involved are supposed to reach some sort of agreement about releasing Western prisoners in exchange for freeing frozen Iranian funds. That's, there's different banks. The example that's come up a lot is that in South Korea, there's money, there's about $7 billion belonging to Iran in banks in South Korea, and South Korea has not allowed Iran to access it because of sanctions, but they would actually, they would like to allow Iran to access it. So the US has not given South Korea an exemption allowing them to do that, even though they wanted, the South Korea had asked for it, and there were some reports that the US would. So in any case, that is one example of what's supposed to happen. So those $7 billion is only a fraction of, what Iran has in banks around the world. And that's sort of supposed to happen. That money is supposed to be released by day zero. It does not say, as far as I know, the draft does not say that the prisoners would be released that day, but there's some sort of agreement pertaining to it. Iran is currently enriching uranium to 60% purity. Weapons grade uranium is 90% purity. This is thought to be the farthest any country that didn't have a nuclear weapon has gone in enriching uranium. On quote unquote day zero, Iran would stop enriching to 60 and reduce enrichment to 20%. And it's also supposed to allow the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, to start monitoring Iranian nuclear sites, because earlier this year, Iran turned all the cameras off. They always gave the IAEA a pretty hard time, but this year they turned the cameras off, and the IAEA is flying blind when it comes to Iran, practically. Now, right after that, the US, the Biden administration would have to bring the deal before Congress, because there's the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act, and that law creates like a 30-day review period in which the House and the Senate would review the deal and then vote on it. And it's not a treaty, right? It doesn't have to be ratified by Congress. But according to this law, if 2/3 of Congress votes against it, then that's a veto-proof majority and the deal can't go through. At this point, it seems that the chances of it are very slim. If there's some sort of major Republican sweep of both houses, which again, even though there's some predictions that Republicans will do well in November, I don't think that we're talking about 2/3 of both houses. And there's some Democrats who oppose the deal, but we saw in 2015 the kind of pressure that was on them. So I doubt it. I wouldn't pin your hopes on a veto-proof majority against the deal, but the possibility exists. And this week, Senators Graham and Menendez, and then a few others, were in Israel, and Menendez said that even if it's not vetoed, the process itself will probably be very enlightening. We'll get a better idea of what is in the final deal, even though I have already reported a pretty good idea of what it's going to look like, but there's going to be for sure more negotiations and back and forth by then. And hopefully more will come to light. So in any case, after it goes to Congress, there is 60 days after day zero. So say Congress is 35, 40 days, and then, another 20 days after that. So 60 days after day zero, we have what's called confirmation day. The UN Security Council and IAEA would be notified. And so their parts of the deal would sort of kick in again. Although the UN Security Council's part is the sunset clauses, which we'll get to later, and those were never canceled. But in any case, the US at that point is supposed to give a sanctions exemption for Iran to sell 50 million barrels of oil. And they would allow businesses, even though the sanctions are not lifted yet, they would allow businesses to start negotiating for when sanctions are lifted in the areas of energy and aviation. At that point, Iran would reduce its uranium enrichment from 20% to only 5% purity. And they would allow further monitoring by the IAEA. I don't have the details of what the difference is between what IAEA is supposed to do on day 0 and what they're supposed to do on confirmation day, but confirmation day is supposed to be full monitoring. 2 months after that, day 120 is re-implementation day. Iran and the US would have to declare their intention to continue the return to the deal about a week before that, or the deadline is a week before that. And then that would be, they're fully re-implementing the deal. Iran would have to fulfill its commitments to the IAEA about the ongoing investigations. As I'm sure you know, the IAEA found traces of uranium in sites that were not declared as nuclear sites in Iran. And basically the reason it was able to find those traces is because of the Iranian nuclear archive that Israel smuggled out of Iran. So they sort of followed the information there. In any case, Iran has not given any kind of credible explanation for those traces. It's pretty obvious to anyone who knows what's going on that, you know, Iran had a nuclear weapons program. I mean, that's what is said in that archive that Israel smuggled out. And that's what was going on in those sites. But Iran hasn't given the IAEA answers, and the IAEA therefore is unable to say really that that's what it is. And Iran has demanded that the IAEA close the investigation. They claim that it's political. They claim that it's planted by the Mossad. And the IAEA, with support from Western countries, including the US, is continuing its investigation. So the US and the E3, which is Great Britain, France, and Germany that are parties to this deal, they have said, no, we're not going to support the closure of the investigation without credible answers from Iran. So in any case, those answers are supposed to come by then, by re-implementation day. And that's the point also when Iran would have to finish all the steps required by the Iran deal. So they'd have to scale back uranium enrichment to 3.67%, which is what was permitted in 2015. And they'd have to reduce their stockpile and seal and transfer centrifuges. Now, there's a couple of issues with this, why this isn't as good as what we had in 2015. First of all, they don't have to transfer their stockpile and all their centrifuges out of the country the way it did in 2015. It would just be sealed and left in Iran, and it would be an IAEA seal sort of, and they would be monitoring that Iran doesn't access it. You know, and you could say it's weaker than the 2015 deal. You could also argue that back in 2015, Russia got all of the things that were transferred out of Iran, and maybe that's not any better. That's, you know, I think people can differ on that one. In any case, at that point, the US would remove secondary sanctions on Iran and certain terrorist designations, but not the IRGC. And and the US is supposed to do sort of a public relations campaign to explain to businesses that, you know, relevant businesses, at least, that these sanctions have been lifted and then they can do business with Iran. This is something else that we'll get back to, but it's really important to Iran that they felt that after 2015, even when sanctions were lifted, people didn't want to do business with them. I'm not sure that that'll change so much now either. Because they saw what happened under the Trump administration, that, you know, the deal could be canceled, at least as far as the US is concerned. But also there are other sanctions on Iran. Also, Iran is not part of all kinds of the like international monetary agreements that would make it, like anti-corruption agreements and anti-money laundering agreements and things like that, that, you know, would make it sort of suspicious for multinational organizations. It would make things difficult for them. In any case, completion day is day 165. So that's 45 days later. All nuclear restrictions and all sanctions relief would come into effect that's listed in the deal. That doesn't mean that there's no sanctions on Iran. The EU has an arms embargo on Iran. The US has all kinds of sanctions on Iran for terrorism and for human rights that are not considered directly related to the deal. In theory, those would remain. However, something that was new, at least when I reported it a couple of weeks ago, and surprising, I thought, that the part of the EU draft of the deal is that the US would lift its conventional arms embargo on Iran. I mean, the EU has a conventional arms embargo on Iran right now. So that's a strange one and a surprising one. Now, the sunset clauses remain. And just to remind everyone what the sunset clauses are, they're from 2015. By the end of 2023, limitations on advanced centrifuge research and development would expire. And in 2025, the snapback sanctions mechanism would expire, which in theory, that was the enforcement mechanism. That was if Iran violates the deal, then all of the sanctions that were lifted in the framework of the deal would come back. I say in theory because when the US tried to invoke snapback sanctions, all the other countries opposed it and it didn't happen. Now, technically, they said they opposed it because the US had left the deal. So this happened after the Trump administration had left the deal. And they said, since you left the deal, you're no longer a party to it, and therefore you can't invoke this. The deal does say that any party to the deal, so any of the countries, could unilaterally invoke snapback. So again, you could argue, I think that it's proven to not be such a strong enforcement mechanism because the parties to the deal have shown that they're not actually serious in using it. But in any case, it expires in 2025. In 2026, restrictions on centrifuges, including advanced centrifuges, expire, or they begin to expire. There's just different types of centrifuges, different types of limitations on them, and that gradually continues in 2028. In 2030, the deal or the nuclear restrictions in the deal completely expire. No limits on uranium enrichment, on stockpiling, heavy water reactors, or plutonium. So this is where my reading from notes can end. So, some people argue the JCPOA doesn't expire. Well, you could say it doesn't expire, but clearly the limitations on the nuclear program expire in 2030. That's the sunset clauses mean. What people mean by it not expiring, maybe they hope the US won't bring back sanctions, but it's just simply not the case. And it's a strange thing that I see people claim sometimes. Now, just to talk about what's going on with the deal. So after this draft was tabled, it was supposed to be the final draft. And then Iran sent back its notes. So instead of a take it or leave it, they gave an answer that was a yes, but. And the two big issues were issues that I touched on here, what they call guarantees and safeguards. So the guarantees come in sort of two different forms. There's the political guarantee. They want to be sure that no future president of the United States leaves the deal like Trump did. And of course, as you know, a current president cannot tie down a future president in terms of his foreign policy unless there's like a treaty ratified by Congress, which this was never meant to be. And unclear that it would be ratified if it was brought to Congress in that way. So, so the Biden administration has said, no can do. The other guarantees are guarantees that people will do business with Iran, which I sort of explained already why it's probably, some people will. We saw like some European airlines were flying to Iran when the Iran deal happened, but it wasn't like the boon that they were getting to their money was more about banking and not about like corporations doing business with Iran. So, and it's, a free market economy. Like the US can do things to try to encourage people to do business with Iran, but it's not, you can't force them. And it's mostly the same for Europe. So, so some companies might do it, but it's not the kind of things that they want just don't, those kinds of guarantees just don't like exist in the US economy, right? So that's an issue. And then the other thing that they want, and I mean, as you saw, I mentioned in the details of the deal, there's different things that the US is going to do to try to encourage, like do sort of a public relations campaign to explain to big businesses, it's okay now, the sanctions are lifted. The other thing that Iran wants is what's called the safeguards, which is about the IAEA probe. So again, the IAEA is investigating these traces of enriched uranium that they found in 3 different sites in Iran, sites that were mentioned in the nuclear archive as places where they were working on their nuclear weapons program. And this was 20 years ago, but still, Iran lied, right? They've been saying all along that they never had a nuclear weapons program, and we basically have a smoking gun that they did. So they're not giving the IAEA any answers. They're blaming the Mossad. They're continuing, like as recently as this morning, calling the probe political and saying they won't return to the JCPOA unless it's closed. And so far, the West has sort of stood up for not politicizing the IAEA and saying that, Iran has to give them answers and we're not going to close it in the framework of the deal. So Iran brought up those problems. The US basically said to them, no. And again, we don't have, I don't think anybody had the actual like pieces of paper in which these things are written, any reporter. So we have little snippets from what we're hearing from diplomats and things like that. And the US, I think, was able to maybe do like a little bit in terms of guarantees, but for the most part, couldn't really do what Iran wanted. There was some talk that Iran was dropping its demands, that they were sort of converging. And then all of a sudden last week, Iran really put its foot down. Well, some of the talk about the converging was because in its response, they didn't mention the IAEA. So people thought maybe Iran had dropped that demand. But then last week, Iran put its foot down on the IAEA probe. And they said the probe has to be closed before they sign, basically. And now the US has said their response is not constructive. The EU, basically their foreign minister, Joseph Borrell, he said that he's no longer so hopeful. He said, what did he say? He said the sides are not converging, they're diverging. That's what he said. And as far as what Israel, what Israeli officials, people in the prime minister's office are hearing from Washington is that because it doesn't look like there's going to be a deal in the next few days, they're going to set this aside probably till after the midterms, because if the deal's not reached really soon, then the review process in Congress will come down to right before the midterms and like 2 weeks before the midterms, and that's not going to be good for that to have the entire Iran deal back and forth campaign. I'm sure everyone remembers what 2015 looked like right before the midterms. Now the question is, will this last? Like if they wait till after the midterms, is there still a deal to be reached? And I think that's an open question. I think for the Biden administration, there for sure is. I mean, they think that this was one of the best things the Obama administration did, and they want to, go back to it. Even though they themselves admit that the non-proliferation benefits, whatever non-proliferation benefits that the deal had in the first place, which were temporary, that they're a lot less relevant because Iran is enriching uranium to a much higher purity. And because of the time, the expiration dates of the different sunset clauses, they understand that it's weaker. But they still would like to get Iran in the box, is a phrase that Blinken had used. I haven't heard him use it in a while, but he was using it when the talk started to get Iran back in the box. And so they see a value in that. So I wouldn't be surprised if the US tries again in November there. But a lot of times, I feel like observing this and writing about it, Iran is like very much in control of like when talks happen or not, what people talk about, and the US is following. I mean, yes, the US has put its foot down and they're not just accepting everything Iran wants, but Iran definitely gets to sort of has the upper hand in terms of like when and how the negotiations happen. And so I think that it's going to come down to them in November. Israel, there's a political debate going on in Israel, but I'll start with what Israel has done since these talks restarted, in recent months. So in February, when it came out that one of the things, well, actually it came out because the Israeli prime minister got up on a stage and said it. It was Naftali Bennett at the time, that one of the things that Iran was demanding is for the IRGC to be removed from the foreign terrorist organizations list. And Israel, really, really opposed that openly. Israel's also opposed to closing the IAEA probe, which also is something that had already come out in early 2022. And the way the current government presents it, including current Prime Minister Yair Lapid, is that their sort of behind the scenes talks with the Biden administration have been effective, and that while the Iran deal is still happening and Israel's not happy about it, and again, we don't know if it's happening, but while the Biden administration still wants an Iran deal and is negotiating an Iran deal, and Israel's not happy about that, at least Israel is able to, influence some incremental changes. And that's sort of how this government sees it, that better to voice opposition in a more cooperative way than to have a public campaign and to go against the current administration and make it into a big fight the way Netanyahu did. Netanyahu, of course, we're before an election, but even before the election was called, Netanyahu was very critical of that approach because he obviously sees things really differently. I mean, for the few months that Biden and Netanyahu overlapped last year, Netanyahu refused to engage with the Biden administration on Iran. He just said, I'm not even going to legitimize these talks by talking to you about them. I personally would say like the jury is out on which approach is better, right? Because official Israel opposes the Iran deal. And there may not be 100% consensus in the security establishment about it, but the vast majority of the security establishment opposes a return to the deal. So, but the Biden administration, like the Obama administration before it, is pretty determined to return to the deal, and I just don't think, on the one hand, we know Netanyahu's campaign didn't stop Obama, and I don't know that a campaign would have stopped Biden now. At the same time, like the IRGC thing or even the IAE thing, like are those such big wins for Israel? I mean, it's good. It's good that those things haven't changed, but it's not a lot compared to an actual Iran deal happening. So it's sort of like, I'm not sure either tactic really works. And I'm not really sure what Israel could do that would really work in terms of stopping a deal. I mean, maybe there's a military option, but that's something else. And so, this is sort of like a political debate, a pre-elections debate, and not necessarily one that's based in the realities of U.S.-Israel relations, I think. So that's where we are, more or less, and I can take questions now.
And we have questions. So
Great.
One comment by a listener, the IRGC removal from the terrorist list. I know the
Yes.
Israelis are opposed to it, and the United States is too. That was just not going to happen. They talked about it on Capitol Hill, and there are 602 Gold Star families whose kids were killed identifiably by the IRGC in Iraq.
Yeah.
And those people made an appearance on Capitol Hill. Let me tell you, that's not, the Biden administration dropped it right there because it was bipartisan. This is not happening. So it's good. There's a place that the Israelis and the Americans are in sync. But from our point of view, whether Israel liked it or didn't like it, that's how the Americans were flying.
Right.
You mentioned that Iran is in control, it seems to some people. And a couple of people noted that something I don't think we knew, or certainly hasn't been publicized, is that we would not be in the room from the beginning, that we don't get there for 165 days. And I think that made people very nervous. At the same time, the IAEA under Rafael Grossi appears to be a more adamant IAEA than previously. Do the Israelis find him a tougher character, and is that good for Israel?
Yeah, I mean, Israelis are, I think, a lot happier with Grossi than they were with his predecessors. He really is standing up for the agency's integrity, and Israelis see that. He's also come to Israel. He met with Bennett, who was prime minister at the time, to discuss the issues with Israel. He's really determined not to close the probe, whereas I think it was Amano at the time of in 2015, right? And he was a lot more willing to like play ball with the political negotiations. So Israelis definitely like Grossi.
That's good. We like him too.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, one of the things you didn't mention is the possibility, but Israel says it periodically, and I think we believe it, that Israel will not permit Iran to end up with a nuclear weapon. And there are various ways, various ways to deal with that. Some of them are preemptive military attacks. Some of them would be cyber attacks. Some of them would be other things, but there are ways to deal with it. How do you see Washington's pressure on Israel in a variety of areas unrelated to Iran? Is this a way of saying to Israel, just keep a low profile? You have pressure on the Palestinians, You have pressure on a lot of things. Are these just ways for Biden to say to Israel, or do the Israelis perceive it this way? Ways to say, don't get out of your lane.
Yeah, so I've heard this theory a bit. And I don't think that it's like that far, like, I don't think it's like a wild theory, but on the other hand, the fact that the Biden administration sort of at the moment seems to be putting Iran talks aside, whereas this week, like we've been like bombarded with one news story after another of administration pressure over things in the West Bank. So I'm not really sure that the two are tied in that way, in a stay in your lane Israel way, as much as I think that the Biden administration, first of all, it has like sort of domestic political pressure when it comes to Israel to show that they're not just like doing whatever Israel wants, because there's this pressure within the Democratic Party, you know, especially the far left of the party. I also kind of think there's, you know, the Biden administration is probably going to be the first in decades that doesn't have some kind of peace plan, you know, or some kind of push for negotiations. And I think they at least say they believe in a two-state solution. I believe them. I believe that that's what they think is right. And they don't want to be the ones who sort of killed it. And so their way of sort of being the ones who didn't kill it is asking Israel to make all of these other sort of smaller concessions to the Palestinians that don't add up to two states or a peace agreement, but in theory, keep the status quo in a way that doesn't make it harder to come to that agreement in the future. That's the logic as I understand it from the Biden administration. I don't necessarily think it plays out for real, and because like the Palestinian Authority doesn't have real control over the Palestinians. Like, just especially the past couple months, it's just things have really deteriorated, and so propping them up for decades at this point is not necessarily what's going to bring peace in the future. But that's how they're looking at it, as far as I can see.
So it's more a holding pattern, kind of kick that can.
Yeah.
Don't let it get away, but you can't necessarily conclude the deal there either.
Right.
Okay, so this raises the issue then, peripherally, really raises the issue of the Abraham Accords countries and their view of this whole situation. Clearly, the Abraham Accords came about for a lot of reasons, but one of those reasons was a fear of Iran and a desire to have Israel and the United States on their side of an Iran deal. Well, Israel is still on their side. The United States is not necessarily anymore exactly on their side in this Iran deal thing. What happens to them, in your opinion, if they can't rely on us to protect them, us, the United States? Do they think Israel can do it alone? Or are they going to start looking at Iran for, to make up with them or make nice with them?
So first of all, I mean, we've seen that they already started looking at Iran a little bit, right? That the Abraham Accord, or the Gulf states' view of Iran, is different from Israel's, because Israel sees Iran as an existential threat, and I think they see Iran more as a strategic threat, but not an existential one. And Iran is their neighbor, and most of them do trade with Iran. So there's definitely been an effort in Gulf states to have more like correct relations with Iran than they had for years. But there's also disappointment in the US, which we saw earlier this year when the leaders of Saudi Arabia and the UAE wouldn't take Biden's calls. That was a pretty obvious expression of disappointment. And I think more than turning to Iran, they're actually turning to China, not necessarily for defense, but they're definitely, China's getting more and more involved in the Middle East economically and in infrastructure projects. And they're kind of like, unlike Israel, which is at least trying to respectfully listen to the US and make some kind of incremental change, the Gulf states are like, you have no say here. And it's of course a problem because the US has army bases. And that was part of the problem in Israel too, is that the Fifth Fleet used to dock in Haifa, and now a Chinese company runs like a private section of the Haifa port. So they're going to have much broader issues, I think, in Gulf states, maybe not in Bahrain, but in other ones. In the UAE, you see it already. So, the US is in many ways squandering its influence with its allies in the Middle East. And to some extent, I think it has to do with this like Obama era theory of creating balance in the Middle East, that if Iran is more powerful, then it'll balance out the Saudis. And, a theory that has not proven itself, because like, why do you want the balance of power to be with a country that's just so clearly against America's interests?
So this goes to two questions that we got while we've been sitting here. Someone says, the nuclear issue is one thing, but the Iranian regime's transgressions don't stop there, but rather start there. How do we make regime change or get it to abandon its destructive policies in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen, or for that matter, among the Palestinians? So is this a very limited,
it's a very big question. I don't know that I have the answers to that, but
Iran deal, but you're still left with all these other programs, even if you get the Iran deal.
Right. Well, that's one of the weaknesses that Israel has always sort of mentioned about the deal, that it doesn't stop Iran's sponsorship of terrorism or its proxy warfare, all its other destabilizing activities all over the region. I mean, more recently, like in the past couple of years, there's been a lot of stuff in the Red Sea and in the Gulf. Yeah, how do you stop it is a good question. I mean, Israel periodically sort of fights back militarily, but an overarching plan is hard to say. I mean, regime change, right? There was the sort of Trump era theory of maximum sanctions pushing them to the brink. And I think that it wasn't, at the risk of sounding like one of those people who says real socialism has never been tried, I think that the maximum sanctions were not given enough time to really have their effect. But, regime change is historically a tricky thing. It's one of those things where, and Israel historically has not really been for it, not necessarily, I don't know about Iran specifically, but in Syria and Lebanon and things like that, because you don't know what, and in the Palestinian Authority, because you don't know what you'll get next, right? I mean, that's also the argument people make about Iran itself, right? That the US sort of maybe bet on the wrong people, maybe Iran a long time ago. But so I definitely don't have the answer on how to make Iran stop. But I do think, giving them all this extra money by lifting sanctions is not helpful. I mean, it does the opposite.
Not helpful. And on the question of regime change, the United States does not have a very good track record in the Middle East. We did Libya. That has not been good for the Libyan people. We did Iraq. It has not been good for the Iraqi people. So there's hesitance. Somebody did ask a question. Why have we taken your regime change off the table as regards Iran? I think the reason is because we haven't been very good at it. Since we did Germany,
I think it's like
in World War II,
right?
Successful.
I think it's just unpopular in both parties, really.
It is.
I mean, at this point, nobody wants to get into a war. And it's not like some little tiny Central American country where even in a tiny Central American country, America didn't do so great. But even then, that you could maybe do it without a war. But in Iran, it would take more than that probably.
Yeah. Okay, but if you're not going to have regime change, and everybody assumes that we're going to cheat, that the Iranians are going to cheat on the deal, then a question here arises: do you think that other states in the region will attempt to become nuclear weapon states? You have Egypt, you have Saudi Arabia. You mentioned as Iran. I mean, truly an enemy, or maybe even Turkey. So what's the possibility that, in fact, if there is instability as the neighbors see it, we get lots of nuclear states?
I mean, the Saudis have already pretty openly hinted that would be something they would do. And there's a concern in Israel, for sure, that a nuclear Iran will lead to a regional sort of nuclear arms race, which will be terrible for the stability of the world. I mean, nuclear arms races are a bit not good, very dangerous. And this is a very volatile region. And it's the same sort of thing that when Libya had a nuclear weapon, where everyone was like, you don't want Gaddafi with a nuclear weapon. So you don't want, maybe, MBS, like as much as I think the Israeli perspective is that the US-Saudi relationship should get back to what it was. Also a volatile person, Egypt has had like, two sort of coups, I guess you could call it, in the past decade. These are not the most stable country, and Turkey has had a history of coups, even though the most recent attempt didn't work. So these are not the most stable countries that you want having nuclear weapons.
No, we don't. I don't, but you can wonder about this.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have got a new question. What did we get? So there are people who think, we got 3 questions actually. People who think that regime change in some parts of the world may work better than in other parts of the world. And there is someone who says that regime change were the United States. I said Japan and Germany, and I was only probably kidding, but South Korea also. Places that we stayed with our military and we ran them are different than the places in the Middle East where, in fact, we didn't stay very long in Iraq. And we didn't stay at all in Libya. We did it from the air.
Well,
and
the US tried to stay in Afghanistan for quite a long time. That
we
didn't work so well either.
We did, but we just haven't been very good at it. So I don't know what I don't know what we're going to get next. So here's a question. Why have we, the West, meaning Israel and the United States, not been able to get the Europeans to reconsider their position? Europeans seem to be pushing fairly hard. Is that a function of oil?
It's an interesting point. I mean, I don't think that it was in the beginning, but now they certainly have an energy problem. So that could definitely be an element in it. I do think that Europe is not like a monolith in this sense, right? The European Union is run by like a bunch of unelected mandarins, and they're the ones who are doing the pushing. They're the coordinators of the deal. Britain and France are losing patience with Iran at this point, but they're sort of following America's lead. So you can sense it in certain things that Macron has said, that Liz Truss has said. Some of their negotiators have tweeted recently. There was a really great tweet by the French negotiator in the Iran deal. He was literally using a meme to express his frustration at Iran not reaching a deal. So there is some sort of impatience in Paris and London where they understand that Iran is just like dragging things out in order to be able to advance its program, but I guess they're not so impatient that they're gonna blow it up when the US is still willing to continue talking. Germany is, I think, more aligned with the EU. You don't hear anything from them that's not just, diplomacy is the solution.
So it's an interesting thought, though, that if you have a stronger IAEA and the Europeans are getting, what should we say, frustrated or a little hopeful, and you have a United States that sees this as not working terribly well. Maybe we could ultimately find some kind of generally united front. That raises the question: if we get a fairly united front, reasonably united front against Iran on the nuclear issue, do they just keep building until they have a bomb? And is all of this waiting then for Israel to do something about it? Because it's unlikely.
It's a good question. And it's also, they're so advanced in their program, and they have been for a while. And they've also, part of it is underground and under mountains and things like that, that it's not like Syria and Iraq were when Israel bombed them. It's not like a one and done. And they have also their own knowledge. I mean, this is a nuclear program that they basically built on their own, as opposed to Syria, which was helped by North Korea, and Iraq, which was helped by France, which is shocking when you think about that. And so, it's not as simple as like just bomb the reactor and we'll be done with it. And so Israel, I mean, I think the general theory understanding in Israel is that there's no like one, Israel can set Iran back, but not really destroy the program. The US has abilities that Israel doesn't, but again, doesn't seem that they have the will. Of course, the Iranian threat to the US is different from the Iranian threat to Israel at this point, at least. So it's hard to say. It's really hard to say where that would go.
There are people on our on our question line who really would like to see regime change. And this is a good comment. Iran was once a great friend of Israel, the United States, and Europe.
Yeah.
People by and large clamor for that time to return. We need to help them topple or at least significantly alter the political regime. So we're coming to the end of this program, and people who listen know that I like to end on a positive note. So do you have something positive to say about the possibility of the return to a time when the Iranian people will be friends of the Israeli people and the American people?
I think that they have good things happening in the Iranian diaspora. The Iranian diaspora, I think, is very plugged into what's happening in Iran today. And they are not, I mean, you know, there's people of all kinds, but I've been in contact with all kinds of activists and journalists, and they are not anti-Semitic, anti-Israel people. Part of them is like the enemy of the enemy is my friend, but plenty of them have been living in the West long enough that they've internalized many of the values. And I think that, you know, if there's hope, together with putting pressure on the regime, and whether it's sanctions or whether in other ways, I think that the Iranian diaspora is probably sort of a place that we can look at with hope that will help bring a sort of more pro-Western approach if that day ever comes.
I'm going to take that as a positive response. I don't know how good they are. I don't know how organized they are, but it's better than thinking of one of the things that deters Israel and deters the United States for excellent reasons is the idea that if you're going to blow up things in Iran, you're going to kill a lot of Iranian people.
Yeah.
Who deserve to be killed, who should not be killed. And anyway, if you think that the long term is that they'll be your friends, they won't be after you bomb their cities to pieces. So
also true.
There are other ways to do it, and Israel has done cyber attacks on Iran. I mean, there are all kinds of other things, but the real holding point for everybody is that if we or Israel bomb Iran in a way that is likely to have a serious effect on the program, we're just going to kill way more people than we're comfortable killing. So I'm going to take as a positive response your thought that maybe the Iranian diaspora will have influence. Maybe the people will be able to get rid of this regime before any of us in the West, have to do something about it. And I'm going to stop there and thank you for a really enlightening and excellent program. And we're happy to have had you, and I hope you'll be back again in the future. Everybody,
sure.
Lahav Harkov, she was great. You can send us more questions. We'll send them on to her, and we will see you in the future. Thank you.